Let's get to Liz Peek. You can follow Liz Peek at Liz Peek. She writes for the Fiscal Times. Liz, you had a great piece the other day on what happened in Dallas, the aftermath of it. I was hoping you'd be able to share that with our audience.
Well, I was offended by some of the remarks made by President Obama, who seems mystified that race relations are deteriorating so quickly in this country. And my concern is that as he constantly supports Black Lives Matter, which is a group that has no discernible structure really or leadership, but where many of the people who are organizing the protests and so forth appear to be violently anti-white, certainly violently anti-white cops. You know, it seems to me that Obama has given his sort of stamp of approval to some language and behavior that really should not be considered acceptable no matter what the circumstances. And, you know, I think we've had 7 years of President Obama constantly implying that race plays a role in nearly everything. Law enforcement, certainly. He has made his whole push for criminal justice reform dependent on the assertion that it is racially biased, that so many young men of color are ending up in prison because of unfair treatment and unfair sentencing laws. And many of the statistics he uses are simply wrong, and I assume he knows that they're wrong, in the sense that he makes a case that people end up in jail just because, you know, they sort of tried marijuana or something. And we all know that simply is not true. It's offensive to me because I think it has led to what now polls are showing is the worst race relation situation in decades. And here we had 2 terms of an African-American president, which kind of attest, I think, to the fact that the country is not indelibly racist, that most people really do have open hearts about people of color and people are different than they are. And yet the president, you know, goes on nationwide TV at the funeral of the cops by a man who arguably was inspired by Black Lives Matter, at least, telling us we all have racism in our hearts. I'm finding it offensive. I do mourn and am appalled by the idea that cops are not careful or legitimately concerned and cautious about using violence and so forth. But I really think that Obama really needs to kind of be held to account here. And no one is doing that. Everyone is so afraid of this conversation in this country that you cannot say that he might have bias in his own heart, which I think he does.
Well, look, Liz, the comments he made in Dallas I thought were reprehensible. I mean, he's with Dallas police officers, 5 of their finest, gunned down, basically executed in cold blood, another 7 in hospitals. You know, their families, they're grieving, and he's got to pump in his own agenda right in the middle of it, talking about DNA of racism and, you know, we're all racist at heart. And then he goes to gun control. And why not just grieve for the dead? Just one time. Just go grieve, get back on your plane and go to Hawaii or wherever you go on vacation. He just can't help himself. And it's
it's true. He can't help himself. And, you know, one of what also offends me, John, is that the press is not covering Black Lives Matter realistically. One of the organizers was standing in the street in Dallas screaming, "Goddamn white America." Okay, somehow that doesn't get reported. Everyone thinks of this movement, if you want to call it that, as this benign, peaceful, righteous group. Well, guess what? That's not entirely true. And so, you know, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, there's a tremendous amount of sympathy for the people who have been seemingly mowed down in cold blood by cops. Okay, I get that. But remember that this movement started out of Ferguson, Missouri, a confrontation involving a thug who had just robbed a store and then attacked a police officer who shot him. And that's where this whole thing comes from. I mean, it is slightly ironic, right? Because to me, After all, that police officer was exonerated. What Obama's message should be is, yes, we have to look at these cases individually. We have a rule of law, by the way, which he does not talk about nearly enough. There's court redress. There is a law enforcement apparatus which is taking each of these incidents and looking at them carefully. But look, we just had a study come out from an African-American professor at Harvard that basically said that blacks are not being shot at or killed by police in out of proportion versus whites. That was a shocking conclusion for this professor who did the research, but that was the conclusion. So are we to believe President Obama, who clearly has an agenda, or are we going to believe people who are actually looking at the data and saying, no, you know what, in terms of this particular issue, that basically law enforcement has killed whites and blacks commensurate with, the proportionate to criminality and so forth. I mean, I think when these conversations, and by the way, the same thing is true of criminal justice reform, begin to spiral based on data that is simply not true, then all Americans should back up and say, well, wait a minute, that's not exactly right. People are not being, Obama would have you think that young men of color are in prison just because they tried marijuana or something. It's not true. The numbers simply don't support his case. And again, in cop killings, the numbers are not supportive of Black Lives Matter. We do have videos of some situations which appear to be just beyond the pale, that cops behave badly. But let's let the Justice Department sort that out. Let's let justice have its way, because that's the kind of country this is.
Well, Liz, you're right. And as far as the Black Lives Matter movement, it is really shocking to me that the mainstream media does not hold them accountable for any of the nonsense they do. I mean, it's turning into a very nefarious organization with the chanting they do. But you nailed it. It was created out of a false narrative.
Yeah.
There was no hands up, don't shoot. The whole thing in Ferguson was the guy's fault. I mean, he was a criminal, and he went for Wilson's gun, and he got shot. And as a result of that, Darren Wilson, the police officer, his life is destroyed, but he got exonerated.
That's exactly
right. So, look,
right.
I got to take off, but you're so right, Liz. Thank you so much. We're going to have you on next week. I'll be at the convention live. Are you going to be there?
I am not going to be there, but I will be watching with great interest.
You'll be there in spirit. New poll just out. New York Times. It's tied. I'll be right back. Follow Liz Peek at Liz Peek.